Would you pray with me? God, who travels with us always, be with us here and now, and be in our words and be in our thoughts and be in our spirits. Amen. So every week, a bunch of us on the staff put all the pieces of the Sunday worship bulletin together into one document, and then every week Amy Turner takes all those pieces and she makes it all look good, and then she circulates that good-looking draft of the bulletin, usually on Wednesdays or on Thursdays. She circulates it to everyone who is going to have a part in the service so that everybody can look it over. And this past Wednesday, Amy sent that bulletin draft out to everyone, and we all chimed in and said that we thought it looked really good. And then someone wrote back to everybody and said, the draft looks good, but what is going on with these passages from Revelation? And that person had a point, because we don't hear that often from the book of Revelation. We don't spend a lot of time with the New Testament's only apocalyptic book. In fact, I looked it up, and in each 3-year cycle of the lectionary that we use, we only get 11% of the book of Revelation as a part of our readings. We only see 11% of this strange book. So it's very rare that we have a reading from it at all. It's very rare that we hear much from the apocalypse. But as I was thinking about today, as I was thinking about this day when we are celebrating and honoring our commitment to creation justice, and as we are celebrating Earth Day, and as we live through our own times that feel a little bit apocalyptic sometimes, I couldn't stop thinking about these two passages from Revelation. Maybe like me, you grew up hearing that the book of Revelation is about the future. And maybe like me, you grew up hearing that the book of Revelation is a book full of threats. Maybe like me, you grew up being taught that Revelation describes a scary time, maybe a time just right around the corner, a scary time when God would begin to tear the world down. That's what I grew up hearing, and maybe you did too, but here's the truth, or at least the truth as I understand it now. The truth as I understand it is that the book of Revelation is about the future, but it's not about our future. And it is a book about threats, but it's less about God's threats, and it's more about the way the world is threatened by injustice. The book of Revelation was written by people who felt like their world was hopelessly broken. The book of Revelation was written by people who felt helpless on the underside of a powerful empire, and Revelation describes the future that those people envisioned as they lived their lives in the late first century. And the thing that we now call the book of Revelation was the book that those people wrote to envision the future of their unjust world. Revelation, then, is not so much a book of threats as it is a book of consequences. Revelation is not about God promising to terrorize the world, but Revelation is a book about what might happen if all the pain and suffering that the powerful visit upon the weak were to be suddenly applied to everyone. It's a book about what it would be like if the grief and the distress felt by the people on the underside of the world were suddenly experienced by the whole world all at once. Revelation is not about God threatening everyone with some future annihilation, as I so often heard when I was a child. Revelation is about imagining the consequences of a broken world. We are living in an age of consequences. This year, Colorado's average statewide temperature from January through March was more than 9 degrees above average, and it was almost 3 degrees warmer than the second closest January through March on record. March of this year, last month, if this March had been in April, March of this year would have been the 10th hottest April on record in Colorado. And last month was the hottest Colorado month of all time when compared to the historical averages for that month. Last month was over 13 degrees above average. 95% of Colorado is at some level of drought, and we have the lowest snowpack on record, which you can see for yourself if you've driven up into the mountains lately. And it's not just Colorado, of course. Off the coast of California, the Scripps Institute of Oceanography is measuring ocean temperatures that are 10 degrees above average, getting into the territory where we can expect major die-offs of marine life soon. A study that came out just this week found that the major current in the Atlantic Ocean, the current that regulates the climate here and as far away as Africa and Europe, that current is at its weakest point in 1,600 years, and it is at a far higher risk of collapse than was previously thought. New studies show that the strongest hurricanes are now stronger and more frequent, and coastal cities are facing rising seas, and glaciers are melting, and in many places it simply does not snow anymore. 2025, as it turns out, 2025 was the third hottest global temperature on record, trailing only 2024 and 2023. And this past week, the United States Treasury Secretary made some comments at the spring meeting of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and he said that it is difficult to determine the actual causes of climate change. And he repeated his previous calls for the World Bank to finance, quote, affordable and reliable sources of energy like gas and coal and oil. Speaking at the IMF and World Bank meeting, the Treasury Secretary described climate change as a belief held only by the elite, as a kind of conspiracy theory. And while he said that at a conference for the world's actual elite, the rest of us live in an age of consequences. These two passages from Revelation, they describe a world that's coming undone. They describe a world coming apart at the seams. They are about what the world is like when everything falls apart. And I want you to notice, if you will, I want you to notice how the dissolution of the world, I want you to notice how the falling apart of everything shows up in three different ways. Go back and look at the passages if you want. They're there in your bulletin. In Revelation, consequences show up three different ways. First, the consequences of injustice show up in geopolitics. The kings of the earth will weep and wail when they see the smoke of her burning, it says. They will weep when they see that the great kingdom has fallen. Second, the consequences of injustice show up in economics. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. All your delicacies and your splendor are lost to you, never to be found again, it says. Alas, alas, the great city, clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls, for in 1 hour all this wealth has been laid waste. And finally, the reason we're reading Revelation on Creation Justice Sunday, finally, the consequences of injustice show up in the earth. There came hail and fire, it says, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. A third of the sea became blood, it says. A third of the living creatures in the sea died. Many died from the water because it was made bitter. Woe, woe, it reads, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. The book of Revelation is a book about imagining the consequences of a broken world. And the book of Revelation understands that the injustice of our nations and the injustice of our systems and the injustice of our relationships show up in our politics, it shows up in our economics, and it shows up in our ecologies. Here's a little Greek lesson for the day. There's a very common Greek word, oikos. It's the 44th most common word in the New Testament, appearing 114 times, the same number of times as the word for church, and more often even than the word for truth. Oikos is a common word in the New Testament, and it's also the name of a brand of Greek yogurt, so you've probably seen it on the shelf at the grocery store. But oikos is the Greek word for house. That's why it shows up so much. Oikos is the Greek word for house, but oikos is less interesting on its own, I think, and it's more interesting because of the way it makes its way into modern English. When you combine oikos, which the Greek pronounces ekos, when you combine oikos with another Greek word, nomos, which means law or rule, you get the English word economy, which literally means something like household rules. When you combine oikos with the Greek word logos, which means word or study, you get the English word ecology, which means literally something like household studies. When you combine oikos with the word system, you get the word ecosystem, which describes the workings of a kind of a household. Ecosystem describes the many plants and animals and minerals and elements that live together and that together make up a kind of household. And When you combine the Greek word oikos with the Latin word caedere, which means to kill, you get the modern English word ecocide, which describes the destruction or the killing of the natural world by human beings. The book of Revelation is an ecocidal book. The book of Revelation describes the destruction of the natural world, but the book of Revelation also understands that ecocide is not a threat, but it is a consequence. It understands that ecocide is the consequence of a broken world, that ecocide is a consequence of unjust economics, that ecocide is a consequence of peoples and nations neglecting and even willfully destroying the ecologies and the ecosystems upon which we all rely. So many of us have been taught to understand the book of Revelation as a story about divine vengeance. But Revelation was millennia ahead of its time in understanding that economic exploitation destroys the world, that geopolitical posturing and power-mongering destroys the world. Revelation was millennia ahead of its time in understanding that judgment comes when consumption becomes immoral and when luxury becomes just another way to hurt and destroy each other. There's that list in Revelation 18. There's that list of all the cargo that the merchants of the world buy and sell and then grieve over. There's that accounting of the imperial economy. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for the empire. It says they weep and they mourn since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk and scarlet, all kinds of scented wood, all articles of ivory, all articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oil, choice flour, and wheat, consumption, 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 it reads. All at the expense of ecosystems somewhere. And then in the final words of that section, Revelation helps us understand the final logic of everything that can be bought and sold and the final logic of buying and selling itself, because once we have accepted that it is okay to plunder the earth and its ecosystems to satisfy our desires for wood and our desires for ivory and bronze and olive oil, Revelation says, once we have accepted that the world's economies can serve our need for silver and jewels and fine linen and spices, then it is only a short leap to the last few words of that list. Cattle and sheep, it reads, horses and chariots, and then finally, after everything else, slaves. Slaves and human lives. Slaves and human lives, Revelation says, we begin to think that if we can own and buy and sell everything else, then we can own and buy and sell and consume each other. The exploitation of the natural world always begins and it always ends in the exploitation of other human beings. The misuse and the mistreatment of ecosystems always points to all the other deep injustices of this world. The brokenness in one place is always connected to the brokenness everywhere. One of the other things that many of us were taught about the book of Revelation is that it describes the end of the world. But that is not entirely true. As they imagined the consequences of a broken world, it is true that ancient Christians imagined a world undone and unmade by injustice and greed. They imagined a world tumbling down as its foundations of exploitation failed. But they did not imagine the world's end. Not quite. At the end of the book of Revelation, something changes. All along, Revelation had been about imagining the consequences of a broken world, but there at the end, Revelation becomes a book about imagining the possibilities of a world renewed and a world remade. We see a vision at the end of Revelation. We see a vision of the world reconstituted with justice and with equality and with fairness. We see a vision of the world made new in God's image, and that world of justice and that world of equality and fairness, that world is described in strikingly ecological terms. There's a river that flows through the city that has been made new. There is a tree that grows there, a tree of life, it says, a tree that produces fruit and that gives its leaves for the healing of the nations. And the water of life flows there in that remade world. If the whole book of Revelation is a book of imagining the consequences of a broken world, then there at the end it becomes an imagining of the blessings of wholeness. It becomes a reminder of the blessing of ecology, the beauty of a house in order. Revelation becomes a vision of the future of a world put right and made new. Perhaps that's what we are meant to take away from Revelation. Not all the unraveling and unmaking and destruction and consequences, but the imagination and vision and renewal. Perhaps that is what we are meant to pay attention to, not the violence of geopolitics and not the grief of failed economics, and not even the ecocidal destruction, but the way God is working to put right all the ecologies of this world, the way God is working to heal and renew the delicate ecologies, the logics of this house where we live, and the way God is inviting us to work toward that too. The world is made new in Revelation. All things are made new, and God calls us to that kind of renewal. God calls us to that kind of imagination, even in the midst of so many consequences. God calls us to imagine the possibilities of a world remade. This Earth Day, as we remember together and as we dream together what we might mean by creation justice, let us join God in imagining our world made new. Amen.